I'm going to talk to you about generalizations in the context of human race. I'm going to talk about generalizations in the context of behavioral ecology. Behavioral ecology looks at a behavior and its fitness, costs, and benefits. Here's a picture of Konrad Lorenz, who's famous for pioneering the field of behavioral ecology with his studies of imprinting in ducks and geese. In a nutshell, a generalization is the process of drawing conclusions about a situation without doing a thorough investigation. That is, looking at the package and deciding what's in the package based on cues on the outside of the package. We've been making generalizations about our environment for 570 million years, ever since the first bilateral common ancestor who got this newfangled contraption called a head. This concentration of sensory organs in one part of the body allowed this first bilateral animal to make quick decisions about where to go to avoid predators and where to go to find food. In more recent times, that is in the last several millions of years, our ancestors have had to make generalizations with regard to their social group. This is a depiction of Homo habilis, one of our ancestors who existed in groups of about 40 individuals. They had to make generalizations about other groups of individuals because they wanted to keep resources for themselves and not share them with competing tribes. So from an environmental and a social point of view, our brains are hardwired to make generalizations. We look at the package and decide what's inside the box without actually opening the box and taking a look. Where we get into trouble is when we do this with other human beings. When we generalize about people, we're making a stereotype. And while I would argue that we're hardwired to notice differences, that is, I look at someone else and I can notice things that make them different from me, I would argue that human history makes generalizations completely unreliable. And to understand why those generalizations are unreliable, we have to know a little bit about human origins and our migrations out of Africa. Here we have a depiction of the lineage through time of Homo sapiens. You can see that we originated roughly 300,000 years ago in Africa, and then as time went by we diverged into several populations within Africa, and in the yellow in the upper left-hand corner we actually emigrated out of Africa. When you put that same information onto a map, you can see how and when human populations spread from Africa to the rest of the globe. Importantly, everywhere you see an arrow, that represents a migration event. And in that particular migration event, there was some sort of population bottleneck. Genomic analyses show us that the long-term effective population size in Africa was large, roughly 15,000 individuals. But every time there was a migration event out of Africa, there was a large reduction in population size, or a bottleneck, sometimes as low as 1,000 individuals. The consequence of bottleneck events are dramatic reductions in genetic diversity. This graph represents a frequency distribution for a trait within the African population before a migration event. This could be for any quantitative trait like height or hair color. When we simulate the frequency distribution of this same trait in a population of 1,000 individuals migrating out of Africa, we see a dramatic reduction in diversity. That is, some of the variation is gone and other variation becomes more uniform. When we let those 1,000 migrants increase their population size and then have a subsequent dispersal event, we see another dramatic reduction in diversity. That is, much of the original variation is lost, and the variation that has remained becomes much more common. So looking back at our original graph, we see that most of the variation in human populations exists in Africa. And every migration event from that point forward represents a loss of variation. And if that happens in series, then you're losing and losing and losing. The loss of variation in a small population is known as genetic drift. This is important because it means that most of the variation in human populations after leaving Africa is due to random chance. There are certainly some things that have been selected for, like lactose tolerance, but by and large, differences have arisen randomly. This process is also important because it means for almost any trait that you can think of, there is more variation in Africa than there is in any population outside of Africa. So we're hardwired to generalize, and it's okay and it's natural to notice things in someone else that make them different from you. However, I would argue that it is impossible to look at that person and know anything about them because of the nature of our human history.